"Can I call you Dad just once?" The question echoed on Fifth Avenue like a gunshot. Richard Ashford froze, his fingers paralyzed, holding the paper napkin. The 8-year-old girl in front of him, with wide blue eyes full of unshed tears, waited for an answer he didn't know how to give. It had only been 15 minutes. 15 minutes since he'd seen her crouched in that alley, shivering with cold. 15 minutes since he'd decided to do something completely out of character. Stop, ask, care. And now that impossible question hung between them like thick smoke. I don't, Richard began, but his voice failed. "Just once," Sophie whispered, the tears finally falling. "I promise I won't ask again. I just wanted to know what it's like." 30 minutes earlier, snow fell heavily over Manhattan. Richard Ashford walked down Fifth Avenue, with his hands buried in the pockets of his Burberry coat, ignoring the lit-up Christmas displays, ignoring the happy families, ignoring everything that caused him pain. It was Christmas Eve, December 24th, and he was completely alone. 3 years. 3 years since the accident. 3 years since he'd lost Victoria and Isabella. 3 years building walls around his heart to never feel that pain again. That's when he saw her, a small girl, crouched in the entrance of a narrow alley between two luxury stores. Thin, torn coat, worn-out sneakers, tangled blonde hair. But it was her eyes that captured Richard. Blue, wide, filled with a sadness too old for a child. She held an empty cardboard box and trembled violently. Richard stopped. Every instinct screamed to keep walking, to not get involved, to not feel. But he couldn't. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice coming out harsher than intended. The girl looked up, startled, and backed against the brick wall. "I'm not going to hurt you," Richard said quickly, raising his hands. "I just want to know if you're okay." The blue eyes studied him with a heartbreaking distrust. Finally, she spoke, her voice so low it was barely audible. "I'm waiting." "Waiting for what?" "Waiting for someone to adopt me." The words hit Richard like a punch. "Waiting for someone to adopt me. On the street. On Christmas Eve. As if it were something that simply happened." "Are you alone out here?" he asked, looking around. "I ran away from the shelter this morning." Her voice was mechanical, as if she'd told this story many times. "They were going to send me to another temporary home. The 5th one this year. 5th. People only want me for the government check." Her eyes met his with brutal honesty. "When the money runs out or I do something wrong, they send me back. So I got tired. I decided to wait for someone who really wanted me." Richard felt something break in his chest. This child, so small, already knew the cruelty of the adult world. "What's your name?" "Sophie. Sophie Morgan." She paused. "But Morgan isn't real. It's just what they put on the shelter papers. I don't have a real family." "Sophie," Richard repeated, crouching down to her level. "You can't stay here. You'll freeze. I have nowhere to go. Are you hungry?" Sophie's eyes lit up for a fraction of a second before she hid it. But Richard saw it. He saw the hunger, the desperation, the hope fighting against distrust. "Come on," he said, extending his hand. "I'll take you to eat something hot." Sophie looked at his hand as if it were a trap. "Why?" she asked, her voice loaded with bad experiences. "What do you want?" The question hurt more than Richard expected. It hurt because it revealed how many times adults had hurt this child. How many times kindness had been just a disguise for cruelty. "I don't want anything," he said honestly. "My daughter was almost your age. She died 3 years ago. And I can't leave you here freezing." Something changed in Sophie's eyes. Maybe it was the pain in his voice. Maybe it was the fact that he'd mentioned his own loss. But she placed her small, frozen hand in his. Richard felt a shock at the contact. That tiny hand trusting him. They walked to blocks in silence to a small diner Richard knew. It wasn't fancy, but it served home-cooked food and was almost empty on Christmas Eve. 2 seats, Richard told the waiter, and bring the kids' menu. They sat in a booth in the back. Sophie looked at everything with wide eyes, as if she'd never been in a restaurant before. Maybe she never had. "You can order whatever you want," Richard said gently. "Anything, anything." Sophie studied the menu intently, biting her lip. Finally, she pointed timidly. "Can I order pancakes and hot chocolate?" "You can order 3 servings if you want." When the food arrived, Richard watched Sophie eat. She tried to go slowly, maintain composure, but the hunger was obvious. She devoured each bite as if it were her last meal. "When was the last time you ate?" he asked gently. Sophie stopped, her fork in the air. "Yesterday morning, at the shelter, but it was just dry toast. You can eat slowly. No one's going to take it away." She nodded, but didn't slow down. Richard ordered another serving without her asking. While she ate, Richard watched her. The tangled blonde hair, the dirty and torn clothes, the small hands holding the fork as if it were precious, and those blue eyes that had already seen too much pain. "How old are you?" he asked. 8. "I'll be 9 in January." The same age Isabella would be now. Richard's heart tightened. "Sophie," he began carefully, "can't you go back to the shelter? They must be looking for you." Her eyes instantly filled with tears. "Please don't send me back. Please." Her voice broke. "I know I was bad for running away, but I can't take it anymore. I can't take being thrown from house to house anymore. I can't take pretending everything's okay when people only look at me like a check." "I'm not going to send you back right now," Richard said quickly. "Okay? You're safe here." Sophie wiped the tears with the back of her dirty hand. "Do you have children?" she asked suddenly. Richard tensed. "I had a daughter, Isabella. She was 6 years old when the accident happened." "I'm sorry." Sophie's voice was genuine, loaded with an empathy children shouldn't need to have. "You must miss her a lot." "Every day," Richard admitted, his voice hoarse. Sophie lowered her eyes to the empty plate. For a long moment, only the sound of the restaurant around them filled the silence. Then, without looking up, she whispered, "Can I call you Dad just once?" And there it was. The question that would change everything. The question Richard didn't know how to answer. The question that broke through all the walls he had so carefully built. "Can I call you Dad just once?" The words floated in the air between them. Richard looked at that 8-year-old girl, with her torn coat and blue eyes full of desperate hope, and felt his entire world tremble. "Sophie, he began, but didn't know how to finish. "Just once," she insisted, her voice breaking. "I know I'm not your daughter, I know I never will be, but I just wanted to know what it's like. What it's like to have someone you can call that. Richard closed his eyes. The pain was physical, real, as if someone was squeezing his heart with their hands. Isabella used to call him Daddy with that sing-song voice children have. And after the accident, he'd never heard that word directed at him again. You can, he said finally, opening his eyes. You can call me that. Sophie's face lit up in a way that almost destroyed him. Tears flowed freely now, but there was a smile, small and fragile, on her lips. Thank you, Dad, she whispered, testing the word as if it was something sacred. Richard felt something break inside him. Something that had been frozen for 3 years began to painfully thaw. The waiter approached with the check. Richard paid in cash, leaving a generous tip. What now? Sophie asked, her voice small and frightened. Are you going to take me back to the shelter? Richard looked at that child. He could do the right thing, the legal thing, call social services, hand Sophie over to the authorities, return to his empty life. It was the sensible choice. But when he looked into her blue eyes, filled with simultaneous fear and hope, he couldn't. Not today, he said. It's Christmas Eve. You're going to spend the night somewhere warm and safe. Where? My house. Sophie's eyes widened. Your house? Really? Really? I have rooms to spare. You can take a hot bath, put on clean clothes, sleep in a real bed. Richard paused. Tomorrow we'll decide what to do. But today, you deserve to have a proper Christmas. I won't cause any trouble, Sophie said quickly, desperate not to lose this chance. I promise I'll be well behaved. I won't touch anything. I won't make a mess. I won't, Sophie, Richard interrupted her gently. You don't need to convince me. You can just be a kid for one night. She looked at him as if she didn't understand the concept. They left the diner together. The snow had intensified, transforming Manhattan into a movie scene. Richard hailed a cab, and soon they were heading to Park Avenue. Inside the car, Sophie pressed her face against the window, watching the Christmas lights decorating the city. Her small hands were trembling, not from cold now, but from something that seemed like anxiety mixed with hope. Do you live far away? She asked. Not very. About 15 blocks. Are you rich? The direct question caught him by surprise. Richard smiled slightly. Yes, very rich. Is that why you wear that nice coat? Yes. Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she asked with that brutal honesty only children have. If you're rich, why are you sad? Richard was speechless. How could an 8-year-old see through him so easily? How do you know I'm sad? He asked carefully. Your eyes. They're just like mine when I look in the mirror. Eyes of someone who's lost someone. The observation was devastating in its precision. You're right, Richard admitted. I lost my family, and money doesn't heal that kind of pain. I lost my family too, Sophie said quietly. My mom died when I was 5. Cancer. I never knew my father. Since then it's just me and the shelters. I'm sorry, Sophie. Sometimes I think sad people recognize each other, she said with a wisdom that didn't match her age. Like they have a secret code. The cab stopped in front of an elegant building on Park Avenue. The doorman, dressed in an impeccable uniform, opened the door immediately. Good evening, Ashford, he greeted, but his eyes widened when he saw Sophie. "Good evening, Daniel," Richard responded, placing a protective hand on Sophie's back. "This is Sophie. She'll be spending Christmas with us." Daniel was too professional to ask questions, but Richard saw the curiosity in his eyes. In the private elevator that went straight to the penthouse, Sophie fell into absolute silence, her enormous eyes absorbing the luxury around her. Mirrors on the walls, marble floor, gold buttons. "Is this an elevator just for you?" she asked in wonder. "Yes, you must be very, very rich." The doors opened directly into the penthouse. Sophie took a step out and simply froze. The space was enormous, 16-foot ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows with a panoramic view of illuminated Manhattan, modern designer furniture, artwork on the walls. A 10-foot Christmas tree dominated the living room, impeccably decorated, but with no presents underneath. "Is this all yours?" Sophie whispered, as if speaking loudly would break the magic. "It is," Richard responded, seeing his home through her eyes and realizing for the first time how empty it was. "Luxurious, yes, but empty? Without life? Without love?" Sophie walked slowly through the room, touching things with reverence. She stopped in front of the Christmas tree. "It's beautiful," she said, "but it's sad." "Sad?" "It has no presents, no family photos hanging. No love." She looked at Richard. Christmas trees need love, not just expensive ornaments. Richard felt a lump in his throat. This child saw things that adults couldn't. "You're right," he admitted. "It's been 3 years since I really celebrated Christmas. I only put up the tree because the decorator insists." Sophie walked to a wall full of picture frames, all turned face down. "Can I see?" she asked. Richard hesitated, but nodded. Sophie turned over one of the frames and saw the photo. A younger Richard, genuinely smiling, next to a beautiful woman with brown hair and a small girl with bright green eyes. "Your family," Sophie said softly. It wasn't a question. Single quotes, yes. "Victoria, my wife, and Isabella, my daughter. They were beautiful." Sophie touched the glass of the photo carefully. "Isabella looks happy here." She was. We all were. Sophie turned over several more frames. Each one showed moments of happiness that no longer existed. Birthdays, vacations, everyday moments captured forever. "Why did you turn all the picture frames face down?" she asked. "Because it hurts to look, but it also hurts not to look, doesn't it?" Her blue eyes met his. "Because when you turn them face down, you're trying to forget. But you don't want to forget. You just want it to hurt less." Richard sat on the sofa, his legs suddenly weak. How did this girl understand such complex things? "You're very wise for your age," he said. "When you don't have anyone, you learn to think a lot." Sophie responded, approaching timidly. "Can I sit with you?" "You can." She sat next to him, so small that her feet didn't touch the floor. They stayed in silence for a moment, just looking at the city through the enormous windows. "Mr. Richard," Sophie said finally. "You can just call me Richard." "Richard," she tested the name. "Thank you for not leaving me on the street. Thank you for feeding me. Thank you for letting me call you Dad, even if it's just once." Richard looked at the child beside him. Dirty, thin, wearing torn clothes in the middle of the penthouse's absurd luxury. And he realized something. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel completely alone. "How about we get you that hot bath?" he suggested, "and I'll find some clean clothes for you." "Your clothes? I have some of Isabella's things. I never could bring myself to donate them." His voice failed. "Maybe they'll fit you." Sophie looked at him with those enormous eyes filled with tears. "You'd let me wear her clothes?" "Isabella would love knowing they're helping someone," Richard said, and it was true. Sophie threw herself into his arms in a sudden, desperate hug. Richard tensed for a second, unaccustomed to physical contact, but then his arms closed around her. She was so small, so fragile, and held onto him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that never stopped collapsing. "Thank you," she sobbed against his chest. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And Richard, the billionaire who hadn't cried in 3 years, felt tears streaming down his own face. Richard led Sophie down the wide hallway to the room he hadn't opened in 3 years. The white door had a faded unicorn sticker, and he felt his hands tremble as he turned the doorknob. "This was Isabella's room," he said. His voice choked. The door opened, revealing a sanctuary frozen in time. Light pink walls, a canopy bed with lilac sheets, shelves filled with children's books, and stuffed animals. Every object exactly as Isabella had left it that last morning, 3 years ago. Sophie stepped inside with reverence, as if entering a sacred temple. "It's the most beautiful room I've ever seen in my life," she whispered. Richard watched from the doorway, unable to fully enter. 3 years avoiding that space. 3 years keeping the door closed. 3 years pretending that if he didn't look, the pain would be less. "She liked unicorns," he said, pointing to the stickers on the walls. The comforter with magical prints, the pictures with colorful illustrations. She had good taste. Sophie delicately touched a giant stuffed rabbit sitting in the reading chair. "Can I ask you something?" "You can. How was it?" "The accident." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. No one asked directly. People avoided this subject, changed the conversation, offered empty condolences. But this 8-year-old girl simply asked, without beating around the bush. It was on a Sunday afternoon. He began, surprising himself by speaking. Victoria was taking Isabella to visit her grandmother. An out-of-control truck lost its brakes going downhill. His voice broke. The impact was on the driver's side. Victoria died instantly. Isabella survived 3 hours in the hospital, long enough for me to get there and say goodbye. Sophie approached and held his hand. "What did she say?" "Isabella? She said she loved me. She told me not to be sad." Tears flowed freely now. "She asked me to take care of her toys until she came back. She was 6 years old and still believed she was coming back." "You didn't break your promise," Sophie said with conviction. "What do you mean?" "Isabella died, but you didn't forget her. You kept the room intact, saved the photos, still love her." Sophie squeezed his hand. Taking care of someone doesn't end when they die. It continues in the heart. Richard crouched down and hugged Sophie again, sobbing against her dirty hair. This child, who had nothing, who had lost so much, was teaching him about love and loss. "How are you so strong?" he asked. "I'm not strong," I just learned that crying alone doesn't help. It's better to cry with someone. They stayed like that for a long moment, to strangers united by shared pain. Finally, Richard stood up and wiped his eyes. "Let's get that bath ready," he said, "and find clean clothes for you." The bathroom attached to the room was fit for a princess. Enormous whirlpool tub, illuminated mirrors, shelves full of still-sealed bath products. Richard turned on the hot water and got fluffy towels from the cabinet. "I'll give you some privacy," he said. "Shampoo, conditioner, and soap are here. Use whatever you want. I'll go get clothes." Sophie looked at the filling bathtub as if it were magic. "Richard," she called when he was almost leaving. "Yes. Do you think Isabella would be mad that I'm using her things?" Richard returned and knelt down to Sophie's level. Isabella had the most generous heart I've ever known. She always wanted to help others. If she were here, she'd be the first to offer everything to you. He gently touched the girl's dirty face. "She would have loved you." Sophie smiled through her tears. "I would have loved her to." Richard left and went to Isabella's closet. Opening those doors was like opening an old wound, but necessary. Small clothes organized by color, shoes lined up, winter coats that would never be worn again. He chose jeans, a green shirt with stars, a warm hoodie, and fuzzy socks. Even new underwear that Victoria had bought for Isabella to grow into. When he returned to the bathroom, Sophie was already in the tub, only her head visible among the foam bubbles. Her wet blonde hair revealed its true tone, lighter than it had seemed under the dirt. "Can I come in?" Richard asked from the door. "You can." He placed the clothes on the counter. "I left everything here. When you're done, you can get dressed. I'll go prepare something for you to eat." "Richard," Sophie called again. "Yes? Thank you for everything. This is the best day of my life." Richard's heart tightened. The best day of her life was a hot bath and clean clothes. How much suffering had this child faced to consider this extraordinary? "Enjoy your bath," he said softly. "Take your time." In the modern and practically unused kitchen, Richard opened the refrigerator. It was almost empty, as always. He didn't cook, lived on delivery food and meals at expensive restaurants. But in the freezer, he found frozen pizzas. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. While heating the pizza in the oven, his cell phone rang. It was Andrew Chen, his personal assistant. "Mr. Ashford, sorry to bother you on Christmas Eve," Andrew said. "But I got a strange call from the doorman. He said you arrived with a child." Richard hesitated. He hadn't thought about the legal consequences of bringing a shelter runaway home. "That's true," he admitted. "Sir, this is complicated. If she ran away from an institution, there are protocols. They could accuse you of kidnapping. She was on the street, freezing, hungry. What was I supposed to do? Let her die? No. Of course not. But you should have called social services on Christmas Eve to throw her back into the system that repeatedly failed her." Andrew sighed. "I understand your point, but legally I can afford the best lawyers in the country," Richard interrupted. "Tomorrow I'll handle the situation formally. Today, she deserves to have a proper Christmas. You're getting attached, Mr. Ashford," and attachment can lead to impulsive decisions. Maybe I need impulsive decisions. I've spent 3 years living on autopilot. There was a long pause. Finally, Andrew spoke more softly. You sound different, more alive. I'm feeling alive for the first time in years. Just be careful, sir. Children from the system come with complicated stories, trauma, emotional baggage. Are you prepared for that? Richard looked toward the hallway where Sophie was bathing. No, but maybe that's exactly why I need to try. He hung up before Andrew could argue further. The pizza was ready, and he was putting it on a plate when he heard barefoot steps. He turned and almost dropped the plate. Sophie stood in the kitchen entrance, clean, with her blonde hair combed and shining, wearing Isabella's clothes. The transformation was impressive. Without the dirt, it was possible to see her delicate face, the freckles on her nose, the light blue eyes, and it was impossible not to see how much she looked like Isabella. "Is everything okay?" Sophie asked, uncertain. "Do the clothes look good?" Richard had to clear his throat to speak. "They're perfect. You look beautiful." Sophie blushed and smiled, an expression of such pure happiness that it lit up the entire room. "Can I make a confession?" she said, approaching timidly. "Of course. That was my first hot bath in 3 months. At the last shelter, there was only cold water." Richard felt anger boil. How could the system fail so miserably with vulnerable children? "Here you'll have hot baths every day," he said before thinking. Sophie froze. "Every day? Does that mean I can stay?" Richard realized what he'd said. He couldn't promise that. Not legally, not without going through the appropriate processes. But looking at that girl, so full of hope, he couldn't take back the promise. "We'll figure it out together," he said carefully. "For now, you have a warm and safe place." Sophie ran and hugged him around the waist. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. And this time, Richard didn't correct her. They ate pizza together in the enormous dining room that Richard never used. Sophie devoured 3 slices, stopping occasionally to look around as if she still didn't believe where she was. "Richard," she said between bites, do you live here alone? In this huge place?" "I do." "Doesn't it get lonely?" The simple question hit like an arrow. Richard put his slice of pizza on the plate. "It does. Very lonely." Sophie chewed thoughtfully. "I always feel alone too, even when there are other kids around at the shelter. It's different from being alone. It's being alone in the middle of people. You understand very deep things for an 8-year-old. My mom used to say that too." Sophie's eyes grew distant. She said, "I was an old soul in a small body. Tell me about her. About your mother." Sophie's face lit up with memories. She was beautiful. She had blonde hair like mine, but longer, and she laughed a lot, you know? Even when she was sick, she tried to laugh. Tears began to form. At the end, when the cancer was really bad, she'd hold my hand and say that one day someone would love me the way she loved me. Someone would choose me. She was right. Was she? Sophie looked hopefully. Richard reached across the table and held her hand. "Someone will choose you, Sophie. You're special." Before Sophie could respond, the penthouse intercom buzzed. Richard frowned. Who would visit at 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve? "One moment," he told Sophie, standing up. On the intercom, Daniel the doorman's voice sounded tense. "Mr. Ashford, there are 2 social services officers and a police officer here. They say they received a report about a missing child." Richard's blood ran cold. How had they found out so quickly? "Send them up," he said, hanging up. Sophie was standing when he returned, her face pale with fear. "They came to get me, didn't they?" Her voice trembled. "Someone saw me and called." "Sophie, listen. Please don't let them take me." She ran and clung to Richard. "Please, Dad, please. I promise I'll be good. I promise I won't cause trouble. I promise." "Calm down. Calm down." Richard held her firmly. "No one's going to take you while I'm here. But they're the police. You can't fight the police." The doorbell rang. Richard took a deep breath. "Go to Isabella's room," he instructed, "and stay there until I call you. Can you do that?" Sophie nodded, tears streaming, and ran to the hallway. Richard opened the door to find 2 middle-aged women with social services badges and a young, uniformed police officer. "Mr. Richard Ashford?" the officer asked. "Yes, I'm Officer Martinez. These are Helen Parker and Jessica Wu from Child Protective Services. May we come in?" Richard stepped aside, his heart pounding. In the living room, Helen Parker, a thin woman about 55 with a stern expression, got straight to the point. "Mr. Ashford, we received an anonymous call saying you brought a child to your apartment. A child matching the description of Sophie Morgan, 8 years old, who ran away from St. Joseph's shelter this morning." "That's true," Richard confirmed. There was no point lying. Jessica Wu, younger, and with a less hostile expression, asked, "Where is the girl now?" "In one of the bedrooms. Safe, fed, clean." "You understand," Helen said coldly, "that keeping a runaway minor without notifying the authorities is a crime." "I understand. But I found Sophie on the street, freezing, hungry, desperate. It was Christmas Eve. I couldn't just hand her over to the system that clearly failed her." "The system didn't fail," Helen shot back defensively. "Sophie has a history of difficult behavior. She's been through 5 temporary homes this year, because none of them can handle her." "Difficult behavior?" Richard felt anger rise. "She is a traumatized child who lost her mother and was thrown from house to house like unwanted baggage." "Mr. Ashford," Officer Martinez intervened diplomatically, "we understand your concern. But there are protocols. Sophie needs to return to the shelter on Christmas Eve to spend the holiday in a cold institution." Jessica Wu spoke more softly. "Mr. Ashford, I know your intentions are good, but you don't know Sophie's complete history. She has attachment issues, severe anxiety, nightmares. She needs specialized care. She needs love." Richard corrected. "She needs someone who sees her as a person, not as a problem case. You've barely known her for a few hours," Helen said, "and you're already too emotionally involved. That's not healthy. Not healthy." Richard raised his voice. "You know, what's not healthy? Children going through 5 homes in 1 year. Children being treated like burdens. Children sleeping on the street because it's better than the system that's supposed to protect them." "Mr. Ashford," Jessica said calmly, "I understand your passion, but we need to take Sophie back. It's protocol. What if I wanted to start an adoption process? The silence was absolute. Helen Parker stared at him in disbelief. Are you serious? Completely serious, M.R. Ashford, Jessica said carefully. Adoption is a long and complex process. It requires evaluations, home visits, background checks, training. I have the resources to expedite all of that. I have the best lawyers. I have space, financial stability, the ability to give Sophie everything she needs. But you're a widower, Helen pointed out. You've never been a foster parent. You have no experience with traumatized children. I was a father to a little girl for 6 years. I know how to love a child. And as for trauma, maybe I'm exactly the right person because I understand loss like few people do. Officer Martinez studied Richard carefully. You realize this can't be decided tonight? Even with your resources, there are legal processes that take months. I understand. But at least let Sophie spend Christmas here. I'll start the process officially tomorrow. But don't tear her away from here today. Helen shook her head. Impossible. There are rules. Rules can have exceptions. Jessica interrupted, surprising everyone. She looked at Richard. Are you really committed to this? To adopting Sophie? I am. More committed than I've been to anything in the last 3 years. Jessica looked at Helen and Officer Martinez. What if we let Sophie stay temporarily? As an emergency custody placement? Ashford can begin the certification process as a temporary home tomorrow. This is highly irregular, Helen protested. But not illegal, Jessica countered. And look around. Helen, this man can give Sophie stability, at least temporarily while we process the paperwork. Helen clearly didn't like it, but Jessica had a point. I need to see the girl, Officer Martinez said. Confirm she's okay, that she wants to stay. Of course, Richard agreed. Sophie, he called toward the hallway. Hesitant steps. Sophie appeared, her eyes red from crying, holding Isabella's stuffed rabbit. Sophie, Jessica crouched down to her level. I'm Jessica, from Social Services. Do you remember me from the shelter? Sophie nodded timidly. Are you okay? Has Mr. Ashford treated you well? He's treated me better than anyone in my entire life, Sophie said, her voice firm despite the tears. He gave me food, a hot bath, clean clothes. He let me call him Dad. Helen raised an eyebrow. He asked you to call him that? No, I asked. I just wanted to know what it was like. Sophie looked at Richard, and he let me. Sophie, Jessica asked gently, do you want to stay here with Mr. Ashford? More than anything in the whole world. Even knowing you'd have to go back to the shelter later? Sophie's eyes filled with tears again, but she nodded. At least I would have had a real Christmas. One day feeling what it's like to have a father. Officer Martinez looked at Jessica and Helen. I approve emergency temporary placement. 2 days. Then we reassess. Helen sighed heavily. Against my better judgment, I agree. But Ashford, Monday morning, 8 a.m., at the Social Services office. You start the formal process or Sophie goes back to the shelter. Understood. Understood. I'll be there. Jessica pulled documents from her folder. We need you to sign these terms. It's a temporary emergency custody agreement. Richard signed everything without reading. not caring about the legal details. The three women stood to leave. At the door, Jessica turned. "Mr. Ashford, I hope you know what you're getting into. Sophie is a wonderful girl, but she comes with deep scars. She'll test you. She'll push your limits. It's going to be hard." "Everything worthwhile is hard," Richard responded. When the door closed, Sophie ran and threw herself into his arms. "I can stay. I can stay." Richard held her tight, feeling his own tears fall. "For 2 days, at least. And I'm going to fight to make it much longer." Christmas night began with Sophie sitting on the living room floor, staring at the lit tree with amazed eyes. Richard watched from the armchair, a cup of coffee cooling between his hands. "I've never spent Christmas with a real tree," Sophie said quietly. "At the shelters there was always one, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't mine." "This one is yours now," Richard said. "At least for 2 days." Sophie turned to look at him, and there were tears in her eyes. 2 days. Only 2 days. Her voice broke. "Monday they're going to take me back." "They won't. I'm going to start the adoption process." "But Mrs. Helen said it's complicated, that it takes months. What if you give up halfway? What if you find out I'm too problematic?" Richard put the cup on the table and sat on the floor next to her. "Sophie, look at me." She turned, wiping the tears with the back of her hand. "I'm not going to give up on you," he said firmly. "I promise." Everyone promises at the beginning. The first foster family promised too. It lasted 3 weeks. What happened? Sophie lowered her eyes. "I had a nightmare, a really bad one. I woke up screaming and accidentally broke an expensive vase that was on the nightstand. They said I was too disturbed, that they couldn't handle it." "Do you still have those nightmares?" She nodded, ashamed. "Almost every night. I dream about my mother, sometimes about the hospital. I wake up crying." "I have nightmares too," Richard admitted. Sophie looked up, surprised. "You do? Every night?" "I dream about the accident, about the moment I got the call from the hospital, about Victoria and Isabella dying and me not being able to save them." "What do you do when you wake up?" "I stay awake alone, until the sun comes up." Sophie moved closer and held his hand. "You don't have to be alone tonight. If you have a nightmare, you can wake me up." Richard felt his heart tighten. This child, who had her own nighttime terrors, was offering comfort to him. "What if you have a nightmare?" he asked. "Can I wake you up too?" "You can. I promise I won't get angry. I promise I won't send you away." Sophie threw herself into his arms, sobbing. "Why are you so nice to me? You don't even know me." "Maybe that's exactly why," Richard said, stroking her hair. "Maybe I need you as much as you need me." They stayed like that for a long time, hugging on the living room floor, under the light of the Christmas tree, until Sophie yawned. "I think I'm sleepy," she said. "Let's get you to bed." In Isabella's room, Richard made the bed while Sophie chose a book from the shelf. "Can you read to me?" she asked timidly, holding a copy of The Little Prince. "Of course." Sophie tucked herself under the covers, the stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest. Richard sat on the edge of the bed and began to read. He didn't make it to the 5th page. Sophie was already sleeping deeply, her breathing soft and regular. Richard watched her for a long moment. This girl had entered his life only a few hours ago, but had already changed something fundamental inside him. For the first time in 3 years, he had a purpose that wasn't just working and accumulating meaningless money. He kissed her forehead gently and left the room, leaving the door ajar. In the living room, he picked up his phone and saw messages from Andrew. Andrew, Mr. Ashford, I've been thinking a lot. If you're really going to adopt this child, I'll help you with the entire legal process. You deserve to be happy again. Richard smiled and typed back, Richard, thank you, Andrew. That means a lot. Monday at 8 a.m. I have a meeting at Social Services. I need the best family lawyers you can find. Andrew, already on it. Merry Christmas, sir. Richard, Merry Christmas. Richard was putting away his phone when he heard a scream. He ran to Isabella's room and found Sophie sitting up in bed, gasping, tears streaming, her body shaking violently. Sophie, he turned on the light and approached. It's okay. It was just a dream. Mom, she sobbed. Mommy was calling, but I couldn't reach her. There were doors, and they were all locked. Richard pulled her into his arms, feeling her tremble. Shhh, it's okay. I'm here. Don't send me away, she begged between sobs. Please don't send me away because of the nightmare. Never. You can have 1,000 nightmares, and I'll be here for all of them. Sophie clung to him as if he might disappear. Can you sleep here with me? Just tonight? Richard hesitated only a second. It wasn't appropriate. Social workers would say it was improper. But looking at that terrified child, he couldn't refuse. Just tonight, he agreed. Sophie laid down again, and Richard sat in the chair next to the bed, holding her hand. Richard, she whispered in the dark. Yes? Do you think my mom would be happy, knowing I found you? I'm sure she would be. And Isabella? Would she be mad that I'm in her room? Isabella had the most generous heart in the world. She would love to share everything with you. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then, do you think they're together now? In heaven? My mom and your family? The question caught Richard off guard. He'd never been particularly religious, but in that moment, he wanted to believe. I think so. And I think they're happy knowing we're not alone anymore. Sophie squeezed his hand. I like to think that too. Minutes later, she was asleep again, but this time, with a small smile on her lips. Richard stayed awake all night, watching her sleep, and for the first time in 3 years, his own nightmares didn't come. When the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sophie woke up slowly. Good morning, she said, rubbing her eyes. Good morning. Did you sleep well after that? I did. I didn't have any more nightmares. She sat up in bed. It's Christmas. The excitement in her voice was pure and genuine. It's Christmas, Richard confirmed, smiling. Can I go see the tree? You can. Sophie ran out, barefoot, and suddenly stopped in the living room. Richard, she shouted. Richard, come see. He got up from the chair, his back aching from spending the night sitting, and went to the living room. Under the tree that yesterday had no presents, there were now at least 20 boxes wrapped in colorful paper. Sophie looked at him with wide eyes. How Richard smiled. While she slept after the nightmare, He'd made desperate calls to luxury stores that made 24-hour deliveries. He'd spent a fortune on gifts, didn't even know exactly what he'd ordered. Had just said everything an 8-year-old girl would love to have. Santa Claus came by. He said, "Santa Claus doesn't exist," Sophie said, but there was hope in her voice. Then I guess it was Christmas magic. Sophie ran to the presents and grabbed one randomly. Her hands trembled as she tore the paper. It was a beautiful doll, with blonde hair and blue eyes. Wearing a princess dress, Sophie hugged it tightly and started crying. "Hey, why are you crying?" Richard knelt beside her. "Because I've never gotten a real Christmas present before," she sobbed. "At the shelters they always give old donations, things nobody wants anymore. But this is new. It's just mine." Richard hugged her. "Everything here is yours. You can open them all." They spent the entire morning opening presents. There were clothes, toys, books, games, art supplies. With each present, Sophie became more animated, more present, more like a child. "This is too much," she said at one point, surrounded by torn wrapping paper and open boxes. "Way too much. You deserve all this and more." Sophie looked at him seriously. "Richard, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Are you doing this because you feel guilty?" About Isabella, the question caught him completely off guard. "What do you mean? Are you treating me well because I look like her? Because you're trying to make up for not being able to save her?" Richard took a deep breath. This child's maturity never ceased to surprise him. At first, he admitted honestly, "Maybe yes. When I saw you on the street, I remembered Isabella. I remembered how much I wanted to protect her and failed." Sophie lowered her eyes. But Richard continued, gently lifting her chin. "Now it's not about that anymore. Now it's about you, Sophie Morgan. About the incredible, brave, and wise girl that you are. I'm not helping you because of Isabella. I'm helping you because you matter. Really, really." Sophie threw herself into his arms once more. "I love you, Dad," she whispered. And Richard, for the first time in 3 years, said the words he thought he'd never say again. "I love you too, daughter." Christmas Day unfolded like a dream. Richard and Sophie made pancakes together for breakfast, or rather, Richard tried to make them while Sophie laughed at his practically non-existent cooking skills. "You really don't know how to cook?" she asked, watching him burn the third pancake in a row. "I've lived 3 years eating restaurant food," he admitted. "I never needed to learn. My mom was a great cook," Sophie said nostalgically. "She made the best pancakes in the world, with chocolate chips inside. Can you teach me?" Sophie's eyes widened. "Me? Teach you? Why not? I bet you remember how your mom made them." Sophie's face lit up. She took command of the kitchen with surprising confidence, instructing Richard about temperature, amount of batter, the right time to flip. "See, perfect," she said proudly when the first pancake came out golden and even. They ate together at the kitchen table, something Richard never did. He always ate alone, distracted by his laptop or phone. But today, he talked with Sophie about everything and nothing. Her favorite cartoons, books she liked, dreams she had. "You know what I've always wanted to do?" Sophie said, licking chocolate off her fingers. "What?" Go to a real park, not those small neighborhood parks. A big park with trees and a lake and ducks. Richard thought for a moment. Central Park is 10 blocks from here. Sophie's eyes widened. Central Park? The famous park. The same one. Want to go now? But it's cold. We have warm coats. And snow in Central Park is magical. 20 minutes later, they were walking down Fifth Avenue toward the park. Sophie wore a new coat Richard had bought, pink with silver details, and held firmly to his hand. "Aren't you embarrassed?" she asked suddenly. "Embarrassed about what?" "Walking with me. People are staring." It was true. People were looking at the well-known New York billionaire walking hand in hand with a child, who clearly wasn't his biological daughter. "I'm not embarrassed at all," Richard said firmly. "I'm proud to be with you." Sophie squeezed his hand tighter. When they entered Central Park, Sophie stopped completely, mouth open. The snow covered everything with a pristine white blanket. Bare trees created intricate patterns against the blue sky. In the distance, the frozen lake sparkled in the sun. "It's more beautiful than I imagined," she whispered. "Come on, let's go to the lake." They walked along the snow-covered paths, Sophie stopping frequently to touch trees, make snowballs, watch birds. Each small discovery delighted her. At the lake, they found an elderly man sitting on a bench, throwing breadcrumbs to some brave ducks that hadn't migrated. "Good morning," the man greeted with a gentle smile. He must have been about 70. White hair, kind blue eyes. "Good morning," Richard responded. Sophie approached timidly. "Aren't the ducks cold?" The man laughed. "Ducks are resilient. They have special feathers that keep them warm." "Really? Really? Want to feed them?" Sophie looked at Richard, who nodded. She took some crumbs the man offered and threw them in the water. The ducks swam quickly toward her. "I'm Edward," the man introduced himself. "Richard, and this is Sophie. Pleasure to meet you both. Christmas Day in the park. How wonderful. Are you alone, sir?" Sophie asked with that childlike frankness. "Sophie," Richard gently reprimanded, but Edward laughed. "It's okay. Yes, I'm alone. My wife passed away last year. Our children live far away. So I come here to feed the ducks. They're good company." "I'm sorry about your wife," Sophie said. "I lost people too. My mom died when I was 5. Edward looked at her with kindness. "I'm so sorry. Dear, it's hard, isn't it?" "It is, but Richard is helping me. He lost people too." Edward looked from Richard to Sophie, understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes," he said softly, "people who've lost something find each other. It's as if the universe knows we need company in our grief." "Do you think it's destiny?" Sophie asked. "I think it's love. Love that doesn't end when people die, but transforms and finds new paths." Richard felt a lump in his throat. This stranger had just articulated something he himself was feeling, but didn't know how to express. "Can I sit with you, sir?" Sophie asked. "Of course, dear." Sophie sat next to Edward and Richard on her other side. The three sat in silence for a while, watching the ducks and the peaceful beauty of the park. "Richard is going to adopt me," Sophie said suddenly. "He promised." Edward smiled. "How wonderful. You're lucky to have found each other." "I'm the lucky one," Richard said. Sophie saved me as much as I'm trying to save her. It's not about saving, Edward said wisely. It's about growing together, about healing together. Sophie looked at the elderly man. You're very wise, sir. I've lived a long time, dear. I've learned that the best families aren't always the ones we're born into, but the ones we choose. My mom used to say something like that, Sophie said, her eyes welling up. She said love isn't about blood, but about heart. Your mother was wise. She was. I miss her so much. Edward gently placed his hand on Sophie's shoulder. She lives in you. Every time you say something wise, every time you love someone, she's alive. Sophie turned and hugged Edward, catching the man by surprise. But he returned the embrace, and Richard saw tears in the old man's eyes. When Sophie pulled back, Edward was smiling. "Thank you," he said. "It's been a while since I received a real hug." "Can I come visit you again?" Sophie asked. "If Richard lets me?" "It would be an honor," Edward said. "I'm here every Christmas Day, feeding the ducks." "Every Christmas?" Sophie frowned. "But don't you get too lonely?" "Not anymore. Now I have a friend who'll come visit me." Richard took a business card from his pocket and wrote his personal number on the back. "Edward, if you need anything at all, call me." Edward took the card, read the name, and his eyes widened. "Richard Ashford, from Ashford Industries." "Yes, I worked for your company," Edward said, surprised. 20 years ago, in the accounting department." "Really?" "Yes, it was the best job I ever had. I paid for my children's college with the salary from there." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. This meeting wasn't a coincidence. It was like Sophie had said, destiny. "Edward," Richard said impulsively, "do you still live in New York?" "I do. In a small apartment in the Bronx." "Are you doing anything for New Year's?" "Nothing planned." "Then you're invited to dinner with us. Sophie and I would be honored." Sophie jumped with joy. "Yes, please, Mr. Edward." Edward had tears in his eyes now. "You would do that? For an old stranger?" "You're not a stranger," Sophie said. "You're our friend." "It would be an honor," Edward said. His voice choked. They exchanged a few more words. Edward wrote down Richard's address and finally said their goodbyes. Walking back through the park, Sophie was radiant. "See, we helped someone today." "You helped," Richard corrected. "It was your idea to approach him. But you invited him to dinner. That was amazing." Richard stopped and crouched down to Sophie's level. "You know, what's more amazing?" "What?" "That 3 days ago, I was completely alone. I hadn't really talked to anyone in years. And now I have you. And Edward. And maybe, for the first time since the accident, I have a family starting again." Sophie hugged him tight. "I have a family too," she whispered. "For the first time in 3 years, I have a father." And there, in the middle of Central Park, on Christmas afternoon, Richard knew with absolute certainty that he would never let Sophie go. No matter how many obstacles the system put up, no matter how long it took, he would adopt her. She was his, and he was hers, destined for each other. The second day together began with Sophie waking up before Richard. He found her in the kitchen, trying to prepare breakfast. "Good morning," he said, rubbing his eyes. Sophie turned around, startled. holding a bowl of cereal. "Sorry, I didn't mean to touch your things. It is just that I woke up and I was hungry and I didn't want to wake you and, Sophie." Richard interrupted her gently. "Breathe." She obeyed, taking a deep breath. "You can touch anything here. This is your home to now. Understand?" Sophie nodded, but Richard saw the insecurity in her eyes. "Come here," he said, sitting at the table. "Sit with me." Sophie sat down, the bowl of cereal between her hands. "What's worrying you?" Richard asked. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. "Tomorrow we go to that office, and they're going to decide if I can stay or not. And you're scared. I'm terrified." Tears began to fall. "What if they say no? What if they say you can't adopt me? What if they send me back?" Richard took her hand. "Sophie, look at me." She raised her red eyes. "I'm not going to give up on you. No matter what they say tomorrow, I'll fight. I have the best lawyers in New York. I have resources. I have determination. And most importantly, I have love for you. But what if it's not enough? It will be. Because when you truly love someone, you move mountains." Sophie stood up and came around the table to hug him. "I love you too," she said. "So much it hurts." Richard held her tight, feeling how small she was, her fragility, and at the same time the incredible strength this child had. "Let's make a deal," he said. "Today we don't think about tomorrow. Today we enjoy every second together, okay?" Sophie nodded against his chest. They spent the morning watching old Christmas movies Richard had never seen. Sophie knew them all by heart, singing along with the songs, laughing at the funny parts, crying at the sad parts. "How do you know them all by heart?" Richard asked. "At the shelter we watched a lot of movies. It was what we had to do." "Did you like the shelter?" Sophie was quiet for a moment. "Parts of it, yes. There were some nice kids. Mrs. Morrison, who worked there, was kind. But," she paused, but it was never really home. You know, it was like a hotel. You stay, but you don't belong. You never belong." Richard felt his heart tighten. "And here?" he asked carefully. "How do you feel here?" Sophie looked around the luxurious living room, then back at Richard. "Here I feel at home. For the first time in 3 years, I feel at home." In the afternoon, the intercom buzzed. It was Andrew, Richard's assistant. "Mr. Ashford, I brought the documents you requested." His voice sounded through the device. "Send him up." Sophie tensed. "Who is it?" "My assistant. He's helping with the adoption process." "You like him?" Andrew Chen entered carrying an enormous folder. He was an Asian-American man about 35, glasses, impeccable suit, but with a kind smile. "Mr. Ashford," he greeted, then looked at Sophie. "And you must be the famous Sophie." Sophie hid behind Richard. "You don't need to be afraid," Andrew said gently. "I'm Richard's friend, and any friend of his is my friend too. She's my daughter." Richard corrected, "Not just a friend." Andrew smiled. "My apologies. Your daughter." The word made Sophie smile shyly. Andrew opened the folder on the dining table. "So, I have good news and bad news." "Bad first," Richard said. "The adoption process can take 6 months to a year. There are psychological evaluations, home visits, background checks, court hearings. Sophie paled. A year. But, Andrew continued quickly, the good news is we can request immediate temporary custody. If approved, Sophie can live here legally while the adoption process happens. And what's the chance of approval? Richard asked. Andrew hesitated. Honestly, with your clean record, financial stability, and this incredible home, 80%. And the other 20%? Helen Parker. She's known for being difficult. If she opposes it, it could complicate things. Sophie sat heavily on the sofa. She doesn't like me. It's not about liking, Andrew explained. It's about following strict rules. But we have Jessica Wu on our side. She seems more flexible. Richard studied the documents. There were dozens of pages of forms, legal terms, requirements. What do I need to do? Tomorrow, at the meeting, you'll present your case. Why you want to adopt Sophie? Why you'd be a good father? How you can provide everything she needs? What if I tell the truth? Richard asked. That she saved me as much as I'm trying to save her. That would be perfect, Andrew said. Honesty is always the best approach. After Andrew left, Sophie stayed quiet, looking out the window. What are you thinking about? Richard asked. That a year is a long time. A lot can go wrong in a year, or a lot can go right. Do you promise you won't give up? Even if it's hard, even if I do something wrong. Richard knelt in front of her. Sophie Morgan, I solemnly promise that I will never, ever give up on you. You can break 1,000 vases, have 1,000 nightmares, make 1,000 mistakes. It doesn't matter. You're my daughter now, and real parents don't give up. My real father gave up, Sophie said quietly. He left before I was born. Then he was a coward and an idiot. Because he missed the chance to know the most incredible girl in the world. Sophie hugged him tight. Thank you for not being a coward. Thank you for giving me courage. That night, Sophie had another nightmare. Richard heard her crying and went to the room. Hey, it's okay, he said, turning on the light. But this time, Sophie wasn't just crying. She was shaking violently, sweat covering her face, eyes glazed. Sophie, Sophie? Richard shook her gently. She blinked, focusing on him slowly. Richard, I'm here. What happened? I dreamed that tomorrow they took me away. That you tried to stop them, but couldn't. And I was screaming your name, but you couldn't hear me. Richard pulled her into his arms. That's not going to happen. You can't promise that. I can promise I'll fight with everything I have. Sophie sobbed against his shoulder. I can't go back to the shelter. I can't be just a number again. I can't. SHHH? You're not going back. I'll make sure of that. How? How can you be sure? Richard took a deep breath. He was going to say something he didn't have permission to say, something Andrew would probably reprimand him for. But he didn't care. Because if they try to take you from me tomorrow, I'll sue the city. I'll sue the state. I'll use every penny I have, every connection, every resource. And if even that doesn't work, he paused. If even that doesn't work, we'll leave to another country where I can adopt you more easily. I won't let the broken system hurt you again. Sophie looked at him with wide eyes. You would do that? Leave everything behind? In a heartbeat? Because you're more important than any business, any money, anything. Sophie hugged him tighter than ever. I love you so much, Dad. I love you too, daughter. More than I thought it was possible to love someone again. They stayed like that until Sophie fell asleep again, safe in his arms. And Richard realized his life had changed completely in just 2 days. 2 days ago, he was an empty man, just existing. Now he had purpose. He had love. He had a daughter. And tomorrow, he was going to fight like he'd never fought before to keep her. Monday morning arrived cold and grey. Richard woke up early, his stomach churning with nervousness. At 8 a.m., they would be at the social services office, and Sophie's future would be decided. He found her already awake, sitting on the bed, wearing one of the new outfits he'd bought. I couldn't sleep well, she admitted. I was afraid I'd have a nightmare and wake up tired for today. How are you feeling? Very scared. And you? Terrified, Richard admitted honestly. Sophie got down from the bed and took his hand. But we're going together, right? Always together. They ate breakfast quickly, neither with much appetite. Andrew arrived at 7:30 with Margaret Hayes, one of the most respected family lawyers in New York. She was a black woman about 50, graying hair pulled into an elegant bun, shrewd eyes. Mr. Ashford, she greeted firmly. And you must be Sophie. Sophie waved timidly. All right, Margaret said, opening her folder. Let's review what's going to happen. There will be a preliminary hearing with Helen Parker, Jessica Wu, and a family court judge, Judge Carolyn Foster. They're going to ask questions about your ability to be a father, about your intentions, about stability. What should I say? The truth. Judge Foster is known for valuing authenticity. Over-rehearsed answers. Margaret looked at Sophie. And you, dear, may also be called to speak. They'll ask if you want to stay with Mr. Ashford. I do, Sophie said immediately. More than anything. Great. Then be honest too. Speak from the heart. At 7:50, they entered the grey social services building. The walls were decorated with colourful posters about happy families, but the place had an institutional and cold air. Sophie squeezed Richard's hand tightly. It's going to be okay, he whispered. They were led to a conference room. Already there were Helen Parker, with her stern expression, Jessica Wu, who smiled gently at Sophie, and a woman about 60 in judge's attire, Carolyn Foster. Please sit down, the judge said, her voice firm but not hostile. Richard and Sophie sat on one side of the table, Margaret beside them. On the other side, Helen, Jessica, and the judge. So, Judge Foster began, studying a file. Mr. Richard Ashford, 42 years old, CEO of Ashford Industries, widowed 3 years ago. No living children. Correct, Your Honor. And you found Sophie Morgan, 8 years old, on the street on Christmas Eve, knowing she was a runaway from a shelter, and still took her to your home. Also correct. Yes. Why? The direct question caught him slightly by surprise. Because she was cold, hungry, scared. It was Christmas Eve. I couldn't just leave her there. Many people pass by street children every day and do nothing. Why were you different? Richard took a deep breath. Because when I looked at her, I saw my daughter. Isabella died 3 years ago at 6 years old. Sophie is 8. And I thought, If Isabella were alive, if she were alone on the street, I would want someone to help her." The judge nodded, taking notes. "And now you want to adopt Sophie, after knowing her for only 2 days. I know it seems impulsive. It seems extremely impulsive," Helen interrupted. "Mr. Ashford, with all due respect, you're clearly trying to replace your deceased daughter. This isn't healthy for you or for Sophie." "I'm not trying to replace anyone," Richard said firmly. "Isabella was unique. Sophie is unique. I'm not confusing the two." "Then explain," the judge said. "Why such certainty in so little time?" Richard looked at Sophie, who watched him with eyes full of unshed tears. "Because for the last 3 years, I was dead inside. I functioned, worked, accumulated money, but I wasn't living. When I found Sophie, something awakened. For the first time since the accident, I felt hope. I felt purpose. I felt love." "This isn't about her healing you," Helen said. "She's a child, not a therapist. I know that. But we heal each other. She lost her mother. I lost my family. We understand each other's pain." Jessica Wu leaned forward. "Mr. Ashford, do you understand that Sophie has deep trauma? That she'll need therapy, patience, structure? I understand. And I'm prepared to provide all of that." "And your work?" Helen asked. "You run a billion-dollar company. How will you have time for a traumatized child?" "I'll delegate more. I'll work from home when necessary. My daughter comes first." "Your daughter?" Helen raised an eyebrow. "She's not your daughter yet." "Not on paper," Richard said. "But in my heart, she already is." Judge Foster turned to Sophie. "Sophie, dear, can you come up here to the front?" Sophie looked at Richard with fear. He nodded encouragingly. She stood up and walked until she was standing in front of the judge. "Sophie, no one here is going to hurt you. We just want what's best for you. Understand?" "Yes, Mum." "Do you want to stay with Mr. Ashford?" "Yes, very much." "Why?" Sophie took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and firm. "Because for the first time in my life, someone looks at me and sees me. Not a problem, not a check, not a burden. He sees me. He listens to me. He loves me. But you've only known him for 2 days. How can you be sure? Because when you spend your whole life feeling like nobody wants you, you recognize when someone finally does. And Richard wants me. For real." Helen Parker sighed heavily. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is emotion talking. Children don't have the capacity to make such important decisions. She has the capacity to know if she's loved or not." Jessica Wu countered. "And clearly, she feels genuine love here." Judge Foster studied Sophie for a long time. "Sophie, did you have nightmares while you were at Mr. Ashford's house?" Sophie hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." "And what did he do?" "He stayed with me all night, held my hand, promised he wouldn't send me away because of the nightmares." "And you believed him?" "Yes, because he has nightmares too. He understands." The judge looked at Richard. "Is that true? You have nightmares every night since the accident. But on the night Sophie had hers, for the first time in 3 years, I didn't have mine. Because I was focused on comforting her." Helen rolled her eyes. "This isn't a solid basis for adoption." "I disagree." Jessica said, "A solid basis is love, understanding, commitment." Ashford has demonstrated all of those. Judge Foster closed the file. "I'm going to be frank. This is highly irregular. Adoptions normally take months of preparation, evaluations, training." Richard's heart sank. But the judge continued, "I also know that sometimes the heart knows before the head. I've seen many perfect adoptions on paper fail because genuine love was missing. And I've seen imperfect adoptions thrive because the love was real." So, Richard could barely breathe. "I'm going to grant emergency temporary custody for 6 months. During that time, there will be monthly visits, psychological evaluations for both of you, and family therapy sessions. If everything goes well, the formal adoption process begins in the 6th month." Sophie let out a cry of joy and ran to Richard, who caught her in his arms. "Thank you," he said to the judge, tears streaming. "Thank you. Thank you? Don't thank me yet," the judge said sternly. "This is just the beginning. Being a parent is the hardest thing in the world. You'll be tested in ways you can't imagine." "I'm ready." Helen Parker stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, I'd like to register my objection." "Noted. But my decision is made." When they left the building, Sophie wouldn't let go of Richard. Andrew and Margaret congratulated them, and finally they were alone in the car. "We did it," Sophie said, still not believing. "I can stay for 6 months, and then forever." "Forever," Sophie repeated, savoring the words. Richard drove back home, his heart lighter than it had been in years. There were still challenges ahead, but they'd won the first battle, and together they would win all the others. The first 3 months were magical. Sophie enrolled in a nearby private school, started weekly therapy, made friends. Richard reorganized his work to be present for important moments. Breakfast together, dinner every night, entire weekends dedicated to her. But in the 4th month, the cracks began to appear. It all started when Sophie brought home a low grade from school. Richard didn't get angry, just said gently that she needed to study more. But Sophie interpreted it differently. "You're disappointed in me," she said, eyes wide with panic. "No, Sophie, I just want you to try your best." Mrs. Henderson at the 3rd foster home sent me back because I got a bad grade. Said I was too stupid to be worth it. "Sophie, I would never. You're going to send me away too." She started crying hysterically. "I knew I'd ruin everything. I always ruin everything." Richard tried to hug her, but she backed away, running to her room and locking the door. He stayed outside for an hour, begging her to open it, but Sophie didn't respond. At therapy the following week, Dr. Sarah Winters, a psychologist specializing in childhood trauma, explained, "Sophie has a deep fear of abandonment. Any sign of disapproval she interprets as imminent rejection. It's a defense mechanism. Better to reject herself first than wait to be rejected." "How do I help her?" Richard asked. "Desperate, consistency, patience, constantly reaffirming that you're not leaving. You're going to be tested repeatedly. She needs absolute certainty that you won't give up." And he was tested. Sophie started having explosions of anger out of nowhere. She broke an expensive vase, screamed that she hated him during an argument about bedtime, refused to speak to him for 2 entire days. Each incident broke Richard's heart, but he remembered Dr. Winter's words, "She's testing whether you'll stay." So he stayed. No matter how many times she yelled, he calmly said, "I love you, and I'm not going anywhere." In the 5th month, Helen Parker made a surprise visit. It was a disaster. Sophie had had a particularly difficult day at school. She'd fought with a classmate, refused to do homework. When Richard tried to talk, she exploded, screaming that he wasn't her real father, to stop pretending he cared. It was exactly at that moment that Helen rang the doorbell. She walked in and saw Sophie screaming, Richard trying to stay calm, the living room in disarray from an earlier tantrum. "I see things aren't going well," Helen said with a satisfied smile. "It's a difficult day," Richard explained, "but we're handling it." Handling it? The child is hysterical. Sophie, seeing Helen, became even more agitated. "You came to take me away. I knew it. I knew it would happen." "No one's going to take you," Richard said firmly. "Mr. Ashford," Helen said, "clearly you're overwhelmed. Sophie needs specialized care that you can't provide." "Yes, I can. She's in therapy. We have support. She's out of control." "This proves my original point. You're not prepared." "Shut up," Sophie screamed at Helen. "You don't know anything. You don't know me." "Sophie," Richard said gently, "go to your room. Let me talk to Mrs. Parker. You're going to let her take me." "I'm not. I promise. But I need you to trust me right now." Sophie looked between Richard and Helen, then ran to her room, slamming the door. Helen crossed her arms. "Mr. Ashford, I'm going to recommend that custody be revoked." "You can't do that." "I can and I will. This child is clearly suffering under your care. She's processing trauma," Dr. Winters explained. "Explanations don't change the fact that she's out of control. Everyone has bad days. That doesn't define our capacity. Your final hearing is in 3 weeks. I'm going to present my report recommending against the adoption." After Helen left, Richard sat on the living room floor, his head in his hands. For the first time, he felt real despair. What if he lost Sophie? What if he wasn't strong enough? The bedroom door opened slowly. Sophie came out, eyes red. "You're going to give up on me now, right?" she whispered. Richard lifted his head. "Never. But I ruined everything. Mrs. Helen is going to make you lose me." Richard opened his arms. "Come here." Sophie hesitated, then ran to him. He held her tight. "Listen to what I'm going to say. I don't care if there are 1,000 Helen Parkers against us. I don't care if we have 1,000 bad days. You're my daughter, and I'll fight for you until my last breath. But what if you lose? What if the judge agrees with her? Then we'll appeal, and appeal again, and again, until we win." Sophie sobbed against his chest. "I'm sorry I yelled. I'm sorry I said you're not my real dad. You are. You're more of a real dad than anyone. I know. Sweetheart, I know. You were scared, and that's okay. I don't want to lose you. You're not going to lose me." In the following 3 weeks, Richard and Sophie came together like never before. They did intensive therapy, worked on communication strategies. Sophie learned to express fear without attacking. Richard learned to recognize her triggers. They called Andrew, who called the best lawyers. Margaret Hayes built a solid case. Therapist reports showing immense progress. Letters from Sophie's teachers praising her development. Testimonials from friends and acquaintances. Even Edward, the elderly man from the park, wrote a letter. In my 70 years of life, I've never seen a father so dedicated. Richard Ashford has transformed not only Sophie's life, but mine as well. This is a true family. The night before the final hearing, Sophie couldn't sleep. What if it goes wrong? She asked, sitting on the bed. Richard sat beside her. Then we face it together. But Sophie, no matter what happens tomorrow, one thing will never change. What? I love you. Papers or not, judge or not, you're my daughter. Forever. Sophie hugged him tight. You're the best dad in the world. And you're the best daughter in the world. They slept together that night, hands intertwined, to hearts beating as one. The next morning, they dressed carefully. Sophie wore a blue dress Richard had bought for the occasion. He wore his best suit. Ready? He asked. Sophie took a deep breath. Ready? In the courtroom, the room was full. Jessica Wu was there, smiling encouragingly. Andrew and Margaret with stacks of documents, and Helen Parker with her stern expression. Judge Foster entered, and everyone stood. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here for the final adoption hearing of Sophie Morgan by Richard Ashford. Richard squeezed Sophie's hand. Mrs. Parker, I understand you have objections. Would you like to present them? Helen stood up, adjusting her glasses. Your Honor, I witnessed firsthand Mr. Ashford's inability to control the child's behavior. Sophie was hysterical, out of control. Your Honor, Margaret interrupted. I'd like to provide context. The judge nodded. Margaret called Dr. Winters, who clinically explained about trauma, attachment tests, and Sophie's extraordinary progress. The incident Ms. Parker witnessed was, in fact, a sign of progress. Sophie was expressing repressed emotions in a safe environment. That's healthy. They called teachers, who spoke about Sophie's transformation from a closed-off child to a participative student. They called Edward, who brought tears to everyone's eyes, describing how Richard and Sophie had given meaning to his life again. Finally, the judge looked at Sophie. Sophie, can you come here? Sophie walked to the front, her heart racing. Last time we talked, you said Richard sees you. Do you still feel that way? Yes, he sees me, listens to me, loves me, even when I mess up, even when I have bad days. And do you want him to be your father? Officially, more than anything in the world. The judge leaned back in her chair, studying the documents. The silence was deafening. Finally, she struck the gavel. Adoption approved. The two words echoed through the courtroom like heavenly music. For a moment, there was absolute silence while everyone processed it. Then Sophie let out a cry of pure joy and ran to Richard. Dad, Dad, we did it. Richard caught her in his arms, spinning with her, tears streaming freely down his face. We did it. My daughter, you're officially mine. The room exploded in applause. Jessica Wu was crying openly. Andrew was grinning from ear to ear. Edward, sitting in the back, wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. Even Margaret Hayes, normally professional and contained, had a huge smile on her face. Helen Parker left the room without looking back. Judge Foster struck the gavel again to restore order. Ashford, Sophie Ashford, she said, and Sophie started crying again hearing her new name. Congratulations. This is one of the most unusual adoptions I've ever presided over, but also one of the most genuine. Thank you, Your Honor, Richard said, his voice choked. Thank you for believing in us. Don't thank me. Thank each other. You fought for this. When they left the courthouse, they were greeted by a small crowd. Richard's co-workers, friends Sophie had made at school, even Daniel, the doorman, was there with a bouquet of flowers. Congratulations, Mr. Ashford, and Miss Sophie Ashford, he said, making a theatrical bow. Sophie laughed, still clinging to Richard's neck. I'm Sophie Ashford now. For real. Andrew approached with a wrapped box. For the new Ashford family, he said. Sophie tore the paper and found two matching silver picture frames. In one, a photo of her and Richard taken in Central Park on Christmas Day. In the other, empty space waiting for new memories. So you can fill them with thousands of happy moments, Andrew explained. Thank you, Uncle Andrew. Sophie hugged him, and Andrew was visibly moved. Edward approached leaning on his cane. My girl, he said, opening his arms. Sophie ran to him. Grandpa Edward, I'm officially adopted. I know, dear, and I'm so proud of you. Richard watched the scene, his heart overflowing. In 6 months, he hadn't just gained a daughter, but an entire family. Andrew, who was just an assistant, had become an uncle. Edward, a stranger in the park, had become an honorary grandfather. Margaret, the lawyer, now attended dinners at his home. Let's celebrate, Sophie declared. Giant pizza for everyone. Pizza. Richard laughed. We can go to the best restaurant in the city. I don't want the best restaurant, Sophie said seriously. I want that diner where you took me on the first day, where it all began. Richard felt his eyes well up again. Then let's go to the diner. Hours later, squeezed into booths at the small restaurant, the group celebrated. Sophie was at the center of everything, laughing, telling stories, radiating happiness. Make a toast, someone suggested. Richard stood up, raising his glass of soda. 6 months ago, I was dead inside. I existed, but I wasn't living. Then I found a brave little girl in an alley on Christmas Eve, and she changed everything. He looked at Sophie. You saved me, Sophie. You taught me to love again, to feel again, to live again. Sophie stood up too, her glass raised. And you taught me that families don't have to be blood. That love is a choice. And every day you choose to love me, even when I'm difficult. They toasted under applause and tears. When they returned home that night, Sophie stopped in the living room, looking around. What is it? Richard asked. I'm just recording it in my memory. How I feel right now. Because I never want to forget. How do you feel? Complete. For the first time in my life, I feel complete. Richard hugged her. Me too. Daughter. Me too. The following years brought profound transformation for both of them. Sophie flourished. The shy, traumatized girl became confident and radiant. She graduated high school with honors, earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university, studied child psychology. I want to help children like I was, She explained to Richard, "I want them to know there's always hope." Richard drastically reduced his work at the company. He began sharing a foundation he'd created, Project Second Chances, dedicated to facilitating adoptions and supporting adoptive parents. Edward became a constant presence in their lives until his final days. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep, he left a letter, "Richard and Sophie. You gave me a family when I thought I'd die alone. Thank you for proving it's never too late to love." Sophie's office in her apartment was filled with photos. Her and Richard in Central Park. Family vacations, graduations, birthdays. But her favorite photo remained the first one, taken on Christmas Day, when they still didn't know if they'd have a future together. On an ordinary afternoon, Sophie, now an adult working as a psychologist, called Richard. "Dad, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I just accepted a child for mentorship." A 7-year-old girl ran away from a shelter, was on the street. Richard felt a powerful déjà vu. And I thought of you, of us, of how a single choice to help someone can change entire lives. I'm proud of you. I learned from the best father in the world. That night, Richard found an old journal he kept. In the entry from December 24th, years ago, he had written, "Today I found a girl on the street. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing taking her home, but my heart says yes. Her name is Sophie Morgan, and something tells me our lives will never be the same." Below, with more recent ink, he added, "I was right. Our lives were never the same. They were infinitely better. Sophie Morgan Ashford, the girl who saved me as much as I saved her, the daughter I chose, the family we built, living proof that love doesn't need blood, it just needs heart." And on the last page, he pasted their favorite photo, father and daughter, embracing under the snow in Central Park, to strangers who became family. Below, a single sentence, "Can I call you Dad just once?" Changed our lives forever, and what a blessing it was. So, did you manage to hold back the tears? The story of Richard and Sophie teaches us that family isn't about DNA. It's about love, choice, and courage. It's about truly seeing someone. It's about not giving up, even when things get hard. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button to show your support. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other emotional stories like this one. Comment below, which part moved you the most? Was it when Sophie asked if she could call him Dad? When the adoption was approved? When Richard promised to never give up? And there are so many more beautiful stories waiting for you here on the channel. Binge watch the other stories of overcoming, love, and second chances. Oh, and also comment, what city or country are you watching this story from? I love knowing that these messages of hope reach every corner of the world. Thank you for being here, for feeling the emotions with us, for believing that love always wins. See you in the next story.